Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Rights for Women. If you're watching this on video on either YouTube or the Rights for Women website, you'll see that I've got quite a different background. I'm actually in a bedroom, downstairs bedroom at my daughter's house in Milton in Little Forest, visiting the grand boys and squeezing in a chat with Jo while I'm down here. So hence the very different prison cell-like background. It's a room that's underneath the house. It's brick and only really used by myself when I come to visit. So it's quite unfurnished. Anyway, hopefully the sound is good and everything else is as normal. So welcome to this episode. And my guest today is Jo Riccioni. Jo studied English at Leeds University in the UK and graduated with a master's in medieval literature. She fell in love with Icelandic saga and wrote papers on the Arthurian and Robin Hood legends, all of which have influenced her fantasy writing. Funding her reading habit has taken many forms, and jobs all over the world have included being a painter and decorator, a potato chip grader, a teacher, a corporate trainer, a bookseller, an editor, and a manuscript assessor. Currently, when not working on her own novels, she manages to teach both sex ed and creative writing, although not at the same time. Jo has written award-winning short stories, one of which, Can't Take the Country Out of the Boy, has been optioned for a short film. Her first novel, The Italians at Cleats Corner Store, was signed by Scribe in Australia and published here and the UK, where it won a fiction category of the International Rubery Award with the title The Italians, and was longlisted for the New Angle Prize in the UK. Jo's a Sydney girl, and I first met Jo when she worked at Bookocinno a few years, and our paths have crossed quite a few times since. She's on the northern beaches with her family and her gorgeous border collie, and has the most amazing she shed or writing studio, which I must ask her about. But we're here today to talk about her new release, The Branded. This is it here. If you're looking on video, it's a gorgeous, absolutely stunning cover. It's a page-turning dystopian fantasy, which has a kind of YA adult crossover, I think. The main character is in her teens or a young woman. And I'm going to ask Jo about this issue of where it's aimed at. But even though it's not the genre I would normally choose for myself, it is an absolutely page-turning book and I couldn't put it down. So I'm really excited to be talking to Jo today on the Convo Couch. That was a fantastic chat with Jo Riccioni, and Jo will actually very soon be interviewing Stacey McEwen for Rights for Women. Stacey was on the podcast a little while ago talking about her success with TikTok and BookTok and how that managed to get her first publishing deal for her new book, The Ledge, which is just out, and Jo's going to be chatting to her about that. And just while we're talking books, a little reminder that if you want to find out any more about myself or my books, you can go to pamelacook.com.au. And if you're into ebooks and love reading digitally, my latest release, which came out last year, All We Dream, is currently on special as an Amazon monthly deal at amazon.com.au. It may actually be price matched on other platforms if you wanted to take a look, but it's only $1.49 Australian at the moment. So it's a great time to grab yourself a copy of All We Dream and have a read of that if you haven't done so yet. So thanks for listening. Have a great week. See you on the Convo Couch soon. Jo Riccioni, welcome to the Rights for Women Convo Couch take 2, because I've just realised I didn't press record the first time. Really great book, The Branded, we are here to discuss today, as well as your entire publishing career. And I just wanted to start with asking you, Jo, in your bio, you mentioned that you've always had this fantastic love of reading. You didn't really get into writing as a child, but you've done lots of different careers and you've ended up now writing a brand new fantasy book, The Branded. So how did you get to be here as a writer?
Okay, so I did do literature at uni and I stayed on and did a master's in medieval literature. So that's where my love of things medieval and fantasy comes into play. But I never really thought I could write or be a writer until I had my children in my 30s and I was at home. I found myself, I'd gone from my degree into teaching and then into a corporate job. And I'd given up that corporate job to stay at home with my children, but I needed something else for my brain. And my sister actually put the idea into my head. She said, like, why don't you have a go at writing? Because your emails and letters home over the years of being away overseas have been really funny and entertaining. So I just bought a new laptop at the time because I'd had to give my work one back. So I thought, new laptop, new notebook.
Stars were aligning. Everything was.
And I started writing a short story, and my short stories did quite well. And one of them got selected to be in the Best Australian Short Stories collection that was being edited by Kate Kennedy at the time. And I met Kate at a festival, and she was brilliant. She was so nice, so encouraging. And she said, look, if you've got more short stories, send them to me. I'll send them to my editor, who happened to be Aviva Tuffield at the time, who was working at Scribe back then. And Aviva said, look, send me some more. And I didn't have enough really for a collection. So I went away and worked on them. But at the same time, I enrolled in this. My girlfriend, Barb, said, I'm doing this Faber novel writing academy, which is the first year they're running it, and there's one more place left, and I think it's got your name on it. I signed up and I started writing. Had been working a little bit on a novel idea, but as soon as Aviva found out, she said, send me your novel, because novels are easier to publish than short stories. So I did, and I only had about 20,000 words, and she said, I want to sign it before even written it. Yeah, so I think that the stars aligned basically because Kate introduced me to Aviva. Aviva knew I was on this novel writing academy, and at the end of that Faber Academy, you meet agents and publishers, and I think Aviva had already thought, oh, I've already found this author, not having anybody else snap her up. So I think she was very encouraging. It was like having a mentorship, really. I took a long time to write that novel. I was like a year over deadline. So I wasn't very confident. Yeah. I wasn't very confident in what I was doing, but I felt like Scribe, E&C, and my other editor were brilliant and really took me under their wing. And I got that novel out. But that novel was very close to my heart. It was about really loosely inspired by my family history, and I felt like I needed to get that out, and I needed to do that because it'd been a dream to write about that amongst my family. My family had already said, you should write that novel because it's so interesting. And obviously I've fictionalized a lot of the history and just put some of the facts in, but it was quite cathartic to write about that. But then this is a long way of saying that I went around the houses basically in my novel writing, because then I went away. I won some residencies because that book did okay. It won an award in the UK and got shortlisted.
Yeah, brilliant.
And sorry,
Jo, what kind of genre was that? Was that like more in the literary?
Yeah, no, it's historical fiction. Yeah. It was a little more towards the literary end, but packaged up. They packaged it up like women's fiction, so it sold more.
Handy.
Yeah, and so it did quite well. And then for a debut and with a small publisher, and then I won some awards to go and write my second novel. I was away writing it, and I'd chosen something that was really close to me, close to home, and I don't think I was really ready to write about that. It was too close for comfort, and I really struggled with this second novel, and I ended up becoming really unhappy with it, and it felt really, I often use the word turgid. It was like wading.
Great word.
Yeah, wading through molasses. It was awful. And my writers group was saying, look, Jo, this is making you miserable. Why don't you go away and just write something for fun? And at the time I had a teenage daughter. I was constantly reading her young adult fantasy novels because my secret pleasure. And so I'd had this idea for a long time, way before The Handmaid's Tale came out as a movie, as a series, that I remember reading The Handmaid's Tale in a feminist perspectives on literature course that I was doing at uni back in the 80s. And it only literally been published about 6 or 7 years at the time. I remember thinking that would make a great young adult novel. But I also was studying, back then I was studying a lot of Arthurian legend and the Robin Hood legend and all these Beowulf and all these amazing medieval stories which were all about men. And I was thinking, where are all the women? There wasn't much women's fantasy back then. That's all been rectified now. There's so many great authors doing brilliant medieval fantasy with women characters, female characters. But I wanted to do that, but I was really interested in this whole idea of fertility as a commodity. And I wanted to somehow merge those two ideas together. So I started on this fantasy novel, and it just poured out of me compared to the literary novel. It was so much fun. I had so much fun writing it. And I was like, what am I doing making myself miserable with this when I can still turn a beautiful sentence and really enjoy my language and everything, but make it in a plot-led, fast-paced fantasy.
Yeah. So isn't it interesting, all those different elements that you've mentioned, your studies in medieval literature and the Handmaid's Tale and the feminist sort of angle that you were interested in, how just over time, all that's obviously just been sitting there bubbling away in your brain. And when you started writing, as you say, it just poured out of you.
Yeah. I think stories are like that. Stories need years to percolate. I say that when I teach short story writing. I'm really dubious of these writers who come on after the event and go, sitting on a train and this kid appears to me with this scar across their forehead, and this kind of like really nice packaged stories about how stories were conceived. I don't think it really happens like that. I think it comes in from different angles. I think there's little ideas that merge with other ideas, and I think it takes time for all those things to come together, to conflate.
Yeah, definitely. Just on the short story, before we get on to talking more about the branded, that short story form is quite an art in itself, isn't it? And I'm interested in, how did you find going from, you were obviously quite skilled at that, you were being chosen for best short stories, winning awards and things, and having your short stories published. How did you find that transition from writing short to then writing long form?
That's partly why that's partly why I went on the Faber, I signed up for the Faber Academy, because I'd been working in the short form for so long and I wasn't sure how to go about writing novels, only from my reading of novels. So I wasn't really sure how to go about it. And I think that course gave me a lot of, it put into solid form things that I knew instinctively, and it underscored that. So things that I was doing, it confirmed that, that's what you need to do to keep going. But there was also some key moments in that course where my tutor, James Bradley, you have a couple of one-on-one sessions with your tutor. And I was saying to him, look, I've got to this point in the book where I need something to happen, like the stakes aren't high enough and I don't know where to go. And I don't want to do the cheesy thing and have someone kill someone. And he goes, no, you absolutely do need that to happen, because that is real tension and conflict. You need to dramatize things, you need to up the stakes. So if in doubt, go with the extreme action, and if it's not working, you can tone it down later on. So I remember there were some really great light bulb moments there. And the other light bulb moment I had with James was he got us to write our not a synopsis, a blurb for the book very early on in the piece, like in week 4 or something like that. And I was like, oh my God, I don't even know what my book's about. And that was the whole point. None of us knew what our books were about. How are you going to write it if you haven't at least consolidated that aura or atmosphere of the book? So you don't need to know exactly what happens, but you do need to know what type of book you're writing. You need to know where it's set. You need to know the main characters and their conflict and and what they desire. And you need those key factors to write the blurb. And when you get lost in that saggy middle, somewhere around 40,000 words.
I'm there at the moment with my current project.
You can actually go back and read that blurb and remind yourself, it's like a little roadmap of where you're going. And of course, is again that it's this kind of feeling you get about the novel. I think every book you write has a certain aura about it, or an atmosphere. And sometimes you forget that when you're writing. You need to go back and remind yourself, and the blurb can do that for you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great idea, that whole blurb writing before, or very early on at least. And like you say, it keeps giving you direction. And it's also really forces you to hone in on the turning points of the story, I think, and what's going to appeal about the story to a reader.
And also reminding yourself that this is a story you need to attract readers with. Your book is a commodity that needs to sell. Where's your point of difference? Where's your hook? How are you going to get your readers in to the story? So it's not just about what you want to write about. It's not just about themes that interest you. It's how are you going to present those themes in a way that other people are interested in them too.
Yeah, exactly. So just another quick question about the short story thing, Jo. What sort of skills that you learnt in short story writing do you feel really have helped you with novel writing? I guess the flip side of that previous question.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that less is more, that you definitely have to do that with short story writing, because short stories are more like you're peeking through the keyhole a moment in time. You don't need all the answers right then and there. You let the reader work out a lot of stuff. Every word counts in a short story as well. So, because you're often on limited word count as well. So yeah, less is more, and I think that works in the novel. Like, I think a lot of emerging writers make the mistake of front loading their early chapters, and you trying to tell everything to the reader, trying to tell and not show. The reader's with you for a good 90,000 words, so you've got time to do that slow reveal. You have to get the stakes high to begin with to get them interested, but you don't have to tell them everything. So I think that was a good learning point from short stories, in that you don't have to tell everything up front. And then I guess the other thing was, you don't have to answer everything. You can leave things open a bit. Towards the end of novels, the readers want them wrapped up a bit. They want some answers, but you can leave something in the minds of the reader as well.
Yeah, and I think that engages the reader more, doesn't it? Because you're leaving that space for them to enter the story that way.
Yeah, and it certainly leaves your work up to debate, which can be really beneficial if you want to interest book clubs and things.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
How were your times at Varuna and Bundanon, Jo? Because they're always things that I've been interested in myself and I've never actually done.
Yeah. I've been really lucky in that I've won 4 Varuna residencies for different things. One of the first ones was for short story. It's a short story masterclass week, which was amazing. And then the other 3 were working on short story collections and novels, and they're brilliant. Varuna has to be the top writing residency in Australia, if not one of the best ones in the world, because you get Sheila, you get the kitchen, which, especially for women and women with kids, to go away and have somebody shop and cook for you is half full of finding time. It's not just the time, it's the mental energy that you need to handle all those things in your life. When you're at Varuna, you literally can be 100% in your book. If you wake up at 3 a.m, you can get up and write until dawn, because you've got no kids and no day to try and cope with. The next morning you can actually have an afternoon nap, or you literally can do what you like for 2 weeks. And in fact, I did that because I'd always get put in the same room when I go to Varuna. I get put in this room called the Bear Room. And it always, I don't know what it is, but I'm sure it's haunted, that place, that room.
I've heard about this before.
It gives me nightmares. Every time I'm in that room, it gives me nightmares. Sorry, Varuna, I love you to bits, but I want to come back. Please put me in a different room. But it gives me nightmares, and I wake up in the night. And of course, I can't sleep afterwards. And I get up and write all night.
Okay. Or maybe that's part of the plan behind putting you in that room, Jo. It's working.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get on to chatting about the book. Before we go any further, maybe if you can give listeners a bit of a rundown on what it's actually about. Give us the blurb.
Okay, it's set in a fantasy world that is like a medieval fantasy world, but about 100 years after a virus has decimated the population. And the causes of this virus have been divided into, the majority of people have scars that show they still carry the virus in their blood, and that manifests itself as like a blue freckles on their skin, and they're known as the branded. And there's a small minority of people who are pure skinned, who don't have any of the virus in them, and what that enables them to do is to give birth to stronger, more disease resistant children who can potentially make better armies. So there's a reason why the different surviving colonies are fighting over these, particularly women, pure women, who could be potential breeders. So the 2 main characters, Nara and Osha, are twin sisters, and they're living in this citadel in the far north of the continent, where their women are revered. These pure women are held within a citadel. They're revered. They're matched with pure suitors, and their job is to produce children, basically. My 2 main characters, Nara and Osha, they're very different. Nara, they both grew up in the wilds, in the woods, and raised by their grandmother until they were attacked by wasteland raiders. And as young children, they had to flee their cabin and go and take refuge in the citadel. And so they long for the times, the freedoms that they used to have. So they've tasted freedom. They know what it's like. Nara grew up as a hunter. Her grandmother trained her as a hunter. So she has an affinity with animals, and he really enjoys fighting, learning to fight. She's got a best friend who's a warder guard who trains her in self-defense and how to fight. But her sister is like her academic opposite. She's like she studies old manuscripts. She sneaks down into the archives to study medicine and early herb law. And she's trying, her great ambition in life is to try and find a cure that's going to stop the branded from being so susceptible to disease. What happens is they find themselves on the run from the Citadel. Nara reluctantly befriends a mysterious dog sled driver known only as the Wrangler, who helps her escape with her sister. But the problem is that she doesn't trust him. He's like this mysterious southerner that she knows nothing about, and he seems to know an awful lot about her and her sister and their past. Yeah, so that's how the novel begins, basically.
Yeah, it's such a great concept. Really, as I said, I was really hooked very early on. And I'm really curious, Jo, so you said you had these influences that have been bubbling around for a while and these ideas, but what was your starting point when it came to actually writing? Like, what were you starting with? Were you starting with character? Were you starting with setting? Were you starting with a plot idea?
I think character and setting. So I had this image in my mind of these women being transported across the snow in this sled wagon, which was like a kind of box on skis that was being dragged by horses. And that it was beyond their control. They were being traded by these wasteland traders. So it started with that image. And then I knew I wanted to do something relating to women's bodies and women being used as a commodity for childbirth. And it's like ties into my interest in women still to this day, not having control over their bodies and their choice. Of things that are happening in America absolutely horrify me at the moment, because my other job is I'm a sex educator. So I work with young girls a lot. And I wanted to write something along those themes. The virus thing only came into it much later, but it was before COVID hit.
Yeah, how spooky is that?
I know. My agent had read the book and had said, look, I love the book and I love the writing, but this fertility theme is a bit too close to The Handmaid's Tale. So I think you should change that to it being around a virus. And she just said it because she'd been doing some reading about pandemics. And I said, okay, that sounds like quite a good idea, but it's going to take me a while. So while in the time that I went away, like the 6 months that I took to go and rewrite the book, the bloody COVID hit. And then like, oh, I don't know what's going to go on with this book now. That publishers will either want it or they'll go, we're so over viruses, we don't want to touch it with a barge pole. So I just didn't know how it was going to be received. But the thing is with my book is it's not really about a virus. It's about the fallout of a virus and what happens with society being segregated into pures and impures, basically.
So never having written a fantasy novel or not really being a reader of them to a large extent, how do you go about the whole world building thing when you're writing a book like this? Do you just start and then start to build things as you go? Do you pre-plan? How did you approach all that?
Yeah, I don't know about other fantasy writers, but I think the early chapters of world building are really hard. And I think a lot of authors spend a lot of time on those early chapters, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the world across to the reader. And that's probably why fantasy novels tend to be a bit longer than other novels, because you do need that time for world building. But one of the things you've got to try and do is, and I'm just pitching a course at the moment to a couple of institutions for teaching world building through action and dialogue rather than long paragraphs of explanation or exposition where you're telling the reader the world, which is what you don't want in a novel. You want them straight in the action, and you want the world building to be incidental to character development, to action, to dialogue, really. I think what you do, or what I do anyway, is I write it and then I go away and take out a whole heap of stuff, or put it into dialogue, or try and do it incidentally. So you're trying to get the world building coming in from an angle rather than hunting it head on. Good world building should be incidental. It should feel like the reader actively knows this world with just minimal facts up front, and then gradually you build it as you go along.
And of course, even just some of the words, setting and character descriptions, I use the wastelands. Immediately, I get a picture in my head, the Wrangler.
Yeah.
You're using some labels like that, aren't you, that are incidentally adding to that world?
Yeah, one of the things that editors will do, though, is, especially editors of fantasy books, is they'll say to you, don't overload the reader with too much world specific vocabulary. So you can't have too many unique words that are unique to your world up front in the early chapters. You've got to scatter them through so that the reader isn't bombarded with new concepts early on. So yeah, and also you can have fun with it. You can have fun building some alternative vocabulary, but also I love trying to come up with alternative swear words and alternative terminology for things that we use in our everyday life. Yeah, so you can have a lot of fun with it, but you've got to spread it out a bit so the reader's not bombarded with new stuff.
Yeah. Would you say you're on I know people don't really like the terms plotting and pantsing, and I've heard lately a lot of people using the word discovery writer. So they're discovering the story as they go. Where would you put yourself on that spectrum?
Yeah, discovery writer. I don't plot very much at all, actually, and I think that's a downfall when it comes to series writing. I think you need to know where you're going, at least where you're heading. I prefer that, like Stephen King quote of, it's like driving your car with the headlights on at night, roughly where you're going, but you don't know you don't know what's on either side of the beam, and you can't see endlessly into the future. That's the way I write, and I think that is, for me, it suits me because I love that moment where you're in the zone, and I think most writers have felt it at some point, those rare moments when you're in the zone and something comes left of field and it's right instinctively, this is right. And that's a gift, and you don't get that if you're plotting. If you're overly plotting, you're not giving yourself room for those things to come organically from the story. And I think that's really important, that you have those, that you have room in your writing. And I think some of the best parts of my plotting have come from those organic moments of just letting the story bloom itself.
What's that other quote? I don't know who's no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. So I guess it's the same idea, isn't it? Surprising yourself, then the reader's going to find that a surprising twist or whatever as well.
And I have tried plotting. I've tried plotting and going, okay, this is my palm card for Tuesday, and Tuesday I'm writing this scene. And I just find it terminally boring to write like that. It's no joy because I know what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm supposed to be writing. I do believe, though, in Hemingway's tip to leave your paragraph halfway through in the end of the day, so that you can come back the next day and you just finish that paragraph, and it's a kind of a sneaky way into your writing without having to sit there and look at the blank page.
It pulls you back into the story.
It pulls me back into the story, and it really works for me to do that. So I guess I do know roughly where I'm going for the day. I know what comes next. It's really funny. I don't often shuffle my writing around. People start in the middle, or they'll write the ending, or they'll write a few chapters in. I'm a very chronological writer. I have to know, okay, this scene's done, and now I need a scene where they're going to be out in the wilds. Now I need a romance scene. Now I need something a bit more action-led. So I actively know what I need to write next for my pacing. I think that's not plotted, but it is in my mind.
So you're blending that, and like you say, a lot of that is intuitive, just from excuse me, from years of being a reader too. And you just take on board all those story structures, don't you?
Or a watcher. I've reviewed I used to be really quite strict to my students about, if you're not a reader, then you can't be a writer. It's like trying to be a marathon runner and never having trained. Well, people do marathons and they haven't done any training. So I've started to take that advice back a bit. And I think you do have to be a reader, but if you're a watcher and you watch series and you watch, because I'm a big TV watcher, I watch a lot of movies, I watch a lot of series. I don't watch non-fiction, it's always fiction, but I rewatch favorite films and series. And people will say to me, why are you rewatching that? You've already seen it. So I'm studying story.
Yeah.
And And you do. It's from, I used to do it as a child. I used to rewatch and rewatch favorite movies. And I think you're cementing how story works in your mind. So I've changed my sort of very strict ideas about, if you're not a reader, you can't be a writer. I think if you're a watcher and you watch, you know, how stories are portrayed, I think you can be a writer. You just got to know how to wrangle. True. You've got to know how to wrangle words though as well, and perhaps you can't do that without being a reader.
Yeah. So let's talk about Nara, your main character, who I see as the main character. You mentioned Osher as well, but she's such a feisty, she's just got so much backbone, and I just loved just meeting her and watching her develop. How did you go about developing that character, or was it again that something that just happened as you continue to write? The characters do keep developing all the time. Even in the editorial stage, I'm still developing character as I go along and just constantly layering. But I wanted a good kick-ass main character. A lot of feminist fantasy now, they are strong women. You want women you don't want them to just lay down and be walked all over. And they don't have to be fighters, they don't have to be physical, they don't have to be taking on men's roles. But I think that's what I loved about Nara, is that she thinks she does have to be like a man, but in fact her strength is not that. Her strength is that she's got these other powers that men don't have, and she's also fiercely loyal and never gives up, and has an amazing sense of humor as well. Yeah, she is a fighter, and I wanted her to be a fighter. I love fighting, actually. I love I love watching boxing, UFC. Oh, do you?
Yeah, I'm a big I love fighting. Anybody doing martial arts, love it. I love the fight scenes in action movies. Study them, so that I've got a very Hollywood perspective on my writing. I like to visualize it as a movie. I know that's probably quite bad to say, but I do have a bit of a fetish for fighting. So there is quite a bit of fighting in my book.
Yeah, but it's great because those action scenes, you really not obviously injecting that love of that really strong action into those scenes where that happens in the book.
You can probably tell that there's a section of the book, which is in part 2, where it becomes like a gladiator's ring in a place called the Cooler, and Nara becomes a fighter in that ring, and that speaks to my love of gladiators. I'm half Italian. I grew up visiting Rome every summer and going to the Colosseum, and my favorite films as a kid were Spartacus and about ancient Rome and gladiators. I was absolutely obsessed, and so I just knew I had to have some kind of gladiatorial combat in my book. It's
great. It's another thread, another one of those influences that you've brought into the story. So just strengthens it all. Sorry, Jo, I'm just checking to make sure I've got all these questions covered. Oh yeah, I wanted to talk too about, you mentioned before about this idea of women not having control of their bodies or their lives, and that's of course comes through from very early on in the book. The pure women are controlled by the men, and it's, as you say, it's their job to breed basically and to repopulate the world with pure blooded children and build the world up that way. Were you, I guess, just when you're writing that, you mentioned the Handmaid's Tale as an earlier influence, but it's also drawing on, as you say, I'm guessing, a lot of more contemporary things that we're seeing happening in society now. Were you deliberately feeding all those ideas into that feminist thread of the story as well?
Yeah, I'm always interested in the idea of women being taught, this expectation of women to actually be mothers. I'm really interested in that whole political debate or social debate that women only have value if they eventually have a child. Really, I hate that idea, and I'm also very conscious of wanting to address that. But I'm also a mother. One of my great achievements in life is my children and having children, and I adored that time in my life, and I feel very proud of, and I don't think motherhood is something that does have to be valued. So I wanted to play with that dichotomy a bit in the book, because they're two sides of a coin, but they're not. They can be complementary as long as we're not judgmental about either one. So I was always really fascinated with that debate as a young mum of those women who'd carried on working and those who hadn't. and who's got the better choice, or who's got the more time, or who's being the better mother. And it's not a competition, it's a choice that we need to support in society. And I wanted to definitely address that in the book, which I do with my two sisters, and that was something I was quite conscious of. Now, obviously the abortion debate, although it's not abortion as such, doesn't enter the book, but this idea of unplanned pregnancy does come into the book. That's a bit of a spoiler, but anyway, yeah. So
it's all right. Nobody knows how, so it's all good.
I did want to talk about that because it's part of my job, my day job, sex education. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about those things. And it does terrify me, this idea that we would start to pick the babies that we conceive, which ones are good and which ones aren't good, or whether we want boys or girls. Or...
Well, that's right. I know that's happening, isn't it? Yeah. People are choosing the embryos based on the gender and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and genetic testing to make sure that they're the strongest. They don't have genetic diseases and stuff like that, which is a good thing, but also a bad thing as well, because we're basically cherry picking the gene pool. Yeah, so I did want to discuss those things in the book as well. Yeah,
and also then I'm guessing you were then implementing that advice you'd had from, was it James, when he said just really heighten and intensify the things that you're writing about, how far you can push them. No,
and I definitely think that the practice I had in my first novel with heightening attention, it was a Second World War novel. There was going to be killing and rape and stuff happening anyway, and that was justifiable in that context. But to actually approach it and write it wasn't something that I had planned, but that's what it needed. That story needed that. And so that enabled me, when I got to writing this story, not to shy away from the tricky stuff. I remember the moment when I realized that one of my characters, she has a relationship with her kidnapper, basically. I remember thinking, this is really quite unsavory and I should probably shy away from this. And it turns out he's not really a kidnapper, but I should really shy away from what I want to write about, which is I want her to be pregnant. And I decided, no, I'm going to go there. I'm going to write fearward instead of forward, which is something that Sue will
I love that
often tells her students, write fearward, not forward. Yeah, I'm like, okay, so people don't normally write about teen pregnancy in YA fantasy, but doesn't mean to say I can't. So I did.
Yeah. Fantastic.
So because teens want to read about real stuff, and that is a real issue. That we talk about romance a lot, we talk about sex a lot in teen books, and it's not purely teen, it's a YA adult crossover.
It's definitely a crossover, isn't it? I mentioned that in my intro, actually.
Yeah, and I think Pantera took it on as an adult book, actually, but I think there's plenty of YA readers who really enjoy it. These are real issues. We talk about a lot of really serious issues in YA at the moment: depression, self-harm, suicide, parents dying, brothers and sisters dying, eating disorders. All these really heavy things come up in YA literature right now. But not many people are talking about teen pregnancy, which is one of the age-old issues of the young people's lives. Having sex for the first time and getting pregnant. So it's something that I did want to talk about in the book, and I didn't want to edit it out.
Good on you for going there and being brave enough to do it. And I think when you got to the point, Jo, with writing of this book, because you weren't contracted at the time with this book, unlike your first book, you already knew you had a publisher for it. So when you got to the end and you got to the point where you thought, I think I've done everything I can do with this, what was your next step in terms of then looking for a publisher? Because fantasy can be everything can be a hard sell at different times, particularly at the moment. It's not a really great time for people to be shopping books around, but fantasy isn't a huge seller generally, or isn't in Australia, just with a smaller population. Would you say that's correct? Or
I mean, it's a better seller than literary fiction. Let's put it
true, that is true.
Probably not quite as good as romance, maybe not quite as good as non-fiction as well. I used to work in a bookshop, so there's still plenty of fantasy sales in Australia, but the big market is the US for fantasy. And we do tend to be influenced quite a lot by what we're reading, and that's why I'm trying to really support Australian fantasy writers, because we're up against, like any other genre as well, we're up against US writers as well, and UK writers as well. One of the things I didn't realise was that if you've sold your Australian, New Zealand rights, the UK, which being an English author, I was quite keen for my book to get published in the UK, which my first book did. But this book is unlikely unless I get really big sales, because UK publishers include the Australia New Zealand market, and it represents 40% of their sales. So you've got to have big sales. If you're doing separate territory sales for your book, you've got to have big sales in Australia and New Zealand for a UK publisher to take you on. But when I'd finished writing this book, my first step, I went to a launch of one of Jay Christoph's books, and Garth Nix was launching it for him. And there was a little moment during the launch when Jay was signing where Garth was on his own, and I, being me, approached him and to have a little chat and pick his brains. And I know that Garth used to work in the publishing industry as well as an agent, and publisher and agent, I think. And I said to him, what do you think I should do? Because this is my history. I don't have an agent. I published in the UK and the US for a historical fiction book, but now I've written this fantasy book. And he said, definitely get an agent. Get an agent and try for the US he said, don't actually even try for the UK. It's a mess. Apparently, I don't know quite what that meant, but yeah, he said, try for the US, aim big. So I did. I approached some agents in the US. I got quite good responses actually for full manuscript requests, but I only did about 10 or don't and then they rejected. There was a couple of them sat on it for ages and ages. And then I thought, oh, why don't I use this agent that tried to sell my first book in the US, Catherine Drayton? Why don't I approach her? Because I've already got contact with her. And I did, and she took it on. So I didn't really get very far with pursuing US agents, but I knew that Catherine was already an agent that other publishers got in to sell their US rights. So I thought she'd do a good job of trying to represent me in America. But that hasn't happened yet, but fingers crossed, you never know.
Yeah.
Got to be in it to win it. But yeah, so that was how I approached. Once I'd finished the manuscript, I was definite about wanting an agent for this novel. My other publisher did have first dibs on my second novel, but they're not a fantasy publisher, so they didn't want it. Yeah, so I knew I'd be working with a new publisher. Yeah.
And Pantera have done such a beautiful job of the cover, haven't they?
Haven't they? Yeah, I absolutely love it.
It's amazing with all that gold on it. It's just fabulous.
Yeah, and I love the fact that they've done quite an adult cover, which obviously the YA market are going to love the gold, they're going to love the design. But if they'd put some kind of graphic art on the front, I think it would have flagged it for younger readers. So I love the fact that they've done this hybrid crossover cover, which I really love.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. How do you find the whole business side of being an author, Jo? Excuse me. Like the sort of the marketing that obviously the publisher is doing a certain amount of marketing, but as an author, we're expected to do our own marketing, the social media. How do you find all that side of things? Is that something you enjoy?
I don't know whether I enjoy it. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it, because one minute you're a little hermit who locks themselves away in the shed for a year to write this thing, and then the next minute you've got to be look at me and do all this promotion. So it doesn't really sit very easily. It's a bit of a schizophrenic thing to do, but I think you do have to do it. And I think there's been people who are showing that social media marketing can actually get you contracts and get you huge sales. This afternoon I'm going to interview Stacey McEwen, who's just got her debut fantasy book out, Ledge, which I've just read, and I'm interviewing her for your podcast, Pam. So that's
right. Yes, I mentioned that in the intro, actually.
Yeah, and she's a classic example of someone who's used social media to get amazing sales, amazing exposure, to the point of appearing on daytime TV, which is virtually unheard of for a fiction writer, unless you are an airport best-selling novelist, or have a really unusual hook. Yeah, I think you've got to try and do it, but my big challenge is trying to stay genuine on social media. That can be really tricky for a lot of people. Like, half of me looks at a lot of social media posts and I just go, this is just such rubbish, isn't it, really? What are we doing? But then the other half of me finds it quite entertaining. I do enjoy some of the TikToks that I watch, and I get some great book recommendations from good book talkers and bookstagrammers, and I hear about all different authors that I wouldn't normally have heard about, I think. So yeah, I mean, I do a bit of it. I'm not very good at it. I'm still learning, still taking tips from other people, but I do working and editing little video clips, and I like working with Canva and putting things together.
I love Canva.
yeah, I'm really kind of learning and enjoying. I think you just got to do what you feel comfortable doing. We're all getting to the point where we're feeling a little bit more comfortable putting our faces on video.
Yeah, I know it's taken a while.
I mean, I've resisted that. I've resisted that because it's really hard when you get to middle age and you're not one of these gorgeous bookstagrammers or TikTokers, and you just go, I've really got to put my face on camera.
Do you know what? Do you know what cured me a little bit of that? I have done a course, and I follow a woman called Sophie Hannah. I don't know if Sophie, she's a UK thriller author, and she's got this dream author program, and she does these webinars, and she's got this wild curly hair that she often just obviously doesn't really do anything with other than sit down and buff it a bit with her hands. And I was watching a webinar or something that she was doing one day, and she said was talking about this idea of putting herself out there and putting herself on screen. She said, and then I realized they're not looking at me for my hair or my face or anything. They just want to hear about books, or they want to hear about writing. And I thought, yeah, you know what? You're right. We have to get over ourselves with all that stuff, don't we? But it can be hard.
Yeah, and they're right. The more you put your face on things, the more engagement for sure. Yeah. At one point though, just before I was about to publish the book, I felt like asking my daughter to be the face of it. I was like, hey, how about you pretend you're Jo Riccioni? Because she's got this amazing Instagrammable face as a young adult author. But she's got her own gig that she's pursuing. I can't usurp her identity.
That's right. She's an amazing artist, isn't she?
Yeah, she's pretty good.
Yeah. Jo, the Branded is the first of a duology, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And where are you up to now with the second book?
I've written it. It's done. It's with my editor at the moment, and she'll be going through structural edits on that, ready for an October to 2023 release. Timeframes, it's rolling on. I'm sure there's quite a lot of work I've got to do on book 2, structurally, and then editorially there will be 2. So that's a process. And then in the downtime in between those times, waiting for the editors to get back to me, I'll be working on a new book. Still way too early to talk about it, but it will still be fantasy, maybe a little bit more grounded fantasy. My early pitch for it is gonna be something a bit like a cross between The Name of the Rose and The Bone Clocks. So if you've read those books,
The Name of the Rose, I have.
And David Mitchell's The Bone Clocks. So if you've got any opinions about those books, and think of a genre mash along those lines. So so that's where I'm up to at the moment. I can't wait to get stuck into something new.
That's exciting. Yeah. And Jo, just before we wrap up, what would you say, this is a question I often like to end with, what would you say is at the heart of your writing?
Oh, that's hard. That's difficult. What's part of my writing? I think I do it a lot. I like a good turn. I can't move on unless the sentence is good. I think that comes back down to having studied literature and still reading a lot of literary fiction and poetry and stuff. So I think I have to have that turn of phrase as a big part of the writing. But then I'm a bit schizophrenic in that I do it to be a page-turning book. I want readers to stay up at night reading it. So I think pacing is really important, and high stakes. And I think that's where I get a bit frustrated these days as I get older with literary fiction, because so much of it is great writing, but you just need to want to go on to the next chapter really quickly. And I think a lot of literary fiction books fail in that respect. And I think, what I really love are those books that hit that sweet spot where they've got the pacing and the action, but they've also got those beautiful turns of phrase. And
I think you do exactly that with the Branded, Jo. So you're on the money with that.
Thank you.
Where can people find you online and on socials, Jo?
So I'm at Jo Riccioni on Instagram and Facebook, and I've got Jo Riccioni Author on Facebook. I've my website, www.joriccioni.com, and I'm not really much on Twitter these days. I was thinking about getting back to it. I used to be, but so mainly Instagram, Facebook, and my website.
And are you dipping your toe in the TikTok world, or?
Oh yeah, I am on TikTok. I've just started. But you can follow me on TikTok at Jo Riccioni, and I'm going to be launching a newsletter soon as well.
Great. All right. Well, it's been so lovely chatting to you, Jo, and congrats on the Branded. It's fabulous. And we'll look forward to hearing from you again very soon when you chat to Stacey McEwen.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Very excited.
Thanks, Jo.
See you. Bye.